My name is Mandy Jacobson. I'm the executive producer of the African Oral History Archive, which produced Plot for Peace, and the co-director.
And I'm Carlos Agulló, Spanish filmmaker. I collaborated with Mandy and the archive in this Plot for Peace film as a co-director and editor.
The African Oral History Archive collects the testimonies of people that made a contribution to South Africa's transition to democracy. So over the years we collect the stories through video, and of course we're also collecting a lot of archive that relates to South Africa's transition. And in a news piece of footage, we discovered this news reportage where you see the former apartheid foreign minister giving a man, a Frenchman, an award to thank him for helping with the prisoner exchange, to the release of one of South Africa's prisoners. And they refer to this man as Monsieur Jacques. So this is very interesting for us because we don't really know who Monsieur Jacques is. The time we're gathering all the various stories that leads to South Africa's democracy. So we begin the story of trying to uncover Monsieur Jacques. And that is how the story was born, because once we came to find Monsieur, as we now know him, Jean-yves Olivier, we had a whole nother way to think about what kind of story we were going to tell.
Because Mandy called me.
Yeah.
So I received...
Did you know each other?
No. We had Mandy had a common friend with a Spanish film director, Alejandro Amenabar, with whom I've worked a couple of times, and so they got in touch with me, and I was kind of shocked because I've always worked in fiction films, never in documentaries, and also because I'm not an expert in African politics. I knew nothing about it. So I told her, and she said, don't worry, we have, on the historical part, we have Stephen Smith, who's, he will be our historical advisor and, historical consultant and scriptwriter. So that part is covered. And what we need is a storyteller, not a historian, because we already have one. So we want somebody with a fiction background, because we want this documentary to look more like a political thriller rather than a historical documentary, in order to reach a broader audience, international audience, not necessarily people already engaged into historical documentaries, but also young audiences from Europe or from America or from... So, having somebody who was not emotionally attached to the history of South Africa would bring would help me relate with this audience in terms of having an outside look or an outside view, and seeing what would interest me from that story might be similar to what these audiences might feel interested about. So then I felt challenged with the project, and I thought it was very interesting, and that's how I got in.
I think Jean-Yves took a long time to be convinced that it was necessary for him to tell his story. And so it was important for him that we weren't going to tell a hagiography, something that was just making Jean-Yves look out to be a man of perfection. The interesting part about Stephen Smith was that Stephen Smith covered the regional conflict, in fact the whole of the African continent during the 1980s. So he was there. C'est pas la même avec moi, or even with Carlos, even as a South African. I was involved in the South African context, but Stephen was there. So he was our moral compass. He was the man that could be able to say, but President, I remember this, or Monsieur Botha, I was there. Because a lot of these protagonists, the people we interview, are getting old. Memory and history, forgetting, it all can become a little bit blurry, if I could use that word. So Stephen was really important, and I think Jean-Yves was quite keen on Stephen as a choice because Stephen had written a book, Les Messieurs Afriques, which was a really interesting critique of Franco-African relationships. So we were not choosing people that were just going to be here to tell a hagiography.
But surprisingly enough, in that book and in an article that Stephen wrote, he was highly critical with Jean-Yves Olivier at the time. So the things he wrote about him were not very nice. Actually, I think he said something about when they met together and Jean-Yves had this amount of money in a golden clip, and that he was like with his smoking his cigar. He talked about Jean-Yves in a not very nice way. So I was surprised that Jean-Yves liked to work with Stephen. Yes. We were both directing, and Mandy was more, she was also the producer, so she was doing a lot of production, and I was also the editor, so I was doing a lot of editing, and the two things couldn't be dealt by the same person all the time. So I went to South Africa for like a couple of months, but I couldn't stay, at the end the project was 2.5 years, I have my family, I couldn't be 2.5 years living in South Africa. So I was working from Spain or Lisbon at the time because my wife was working in Lisbon, and we would share the different versions of the cut. We would discuss, get together every now and then, depending on we would use the shootings also as meeting points and have meetings, and that's how.
Because you went together to interviews the different...
Some of the interviews I had done originally with Stephen Smith, and then when Carlos came in, we went back to interview them. When I started doing this, we didn't think we were doing it only about Jean-Yves Olivier. We were kind of researching the story of the regional conflict. So I think then once we got Carlos in, we were trying to look for a more unified style, a look that gave it that political thriller, which I think is what Carlos brought to the story. So then we were lucky to be able to go back. So then Stephen and I would do the interviews. Carlos was worried about the camera. Then Carlos would sometimes want to ask camera, questions. So it was really much a shared experience of trying to make sure that the content we got, because Stephen had also never made a documentary. So as a journalist, you just want to get as much information as possible. And we were trying to kind of be the storytellers on either one of his shoulders. And so that's how it worked. But we were lucky. We were able to go back to Jean-Yves often. Mm-hmm. And that helped a lot. If we'd only had 2 interviews with Jean-Yves, it would have been very difficult. Yeah. But we were able to phone him and say, listen, we just can't work out this part of the story. Please, we need that done.
It was the script was a research process. So not even Jean-Yves told us the story from the beginning to the end. It was because he didn't know what exactly we wanted or we needed. So he would tell us anecdotes here and there, and parts of stories, and because he's lived through so many stories that he didn't know exactly which ones would be good for the film or not.
Good point.
And he would tell us things, and so we didn't know what the story would be like. And then we would interview somebody, then go back to Jean-Yves and say, listen, you didn't tell us about you being involved in this so important... Oh, yes, I didn't tell you about this. Yes, of course. There was also this story. Oh, and this other one. And then we would say, oh, but the president of Congo didn't tell us about that. And so we would go back to president of Congo. We went back to president of Congo 3 times. We went back to president of Mozambique, Chissano, another 3 times. I don't think any of our interviewees was interviewed only once. Winnie
Mandela.
Winnie was only
because
once.
it's difficult to get access.
Big Bota,
we
3
went
times.
Angolan's only once, but if we could, we would have gone. No, Rusty many times.
Rusty many times.
And each time the new anecdotes or the new version of the interview have impact on the script.
We've been through.
Yes, totally.
There's no ways you've got a written script. I mean, a concrete example is the whole story of Jean-Yves tells us this incredibly exciting, from a political thriller anecdote, about how he walked to go and see the rebel leader in Mozambique. It's a country here. Now, Mozambique is not part of our story, but it's a fantastic anecdote of Jean-Yves, of how he went into the real world. He was not sitting in Paris or in the offices of Washington or anywhere. This man was in the real world. So we wanted to do that story. We went back to Jean-Yves. We went back to try and work out that story. In the end, that story couldn't make it in the movie. So there was often those where you would get an amazing example of Jean-Yves' tenacity, of his adventurous spirit, of his risk-taking, but you have to simplify the story. And c'est pas facile.
Even we had 2 interviewees, one in Lisbon, so we had to go to Lisbon, and the other one in Paris, who didn't make it into the cut, because after doing the whole interview we realized that they were not first-hand involved as players in the plot. And we didn't want an expert who knew Jean-Yves and who knew more or less what he was doing and tell us because somebody told him. We wanted people who were involved, and so we decided to cut them out of the
I think that's the strength of the team's product, is that the rule being you don't have any analysis. You know, you don't have anybody commentating. Really, everybody is in that film was players in the drama. And I think that's what probably why people are responding so favorably to the film.
I don't know if my question is pertinent now. Did you start the shooting by the interviews of the VIP?
C'est une bonne question, because with the African Oral History Archive we had some interviews. So we had interviews with Chisano, we had interviews with Pick, and it was through those interviews that I discovered the archive of Monsieur Jacques. But then we had to start going back to those interviews once we first started working with Jean-Yves. So in a way, the first round of interviews was research.
Yeah, but
they
both
were our
for
research interviews.
for content reasons and for visual reasons, we needed to redo the interviews because then they had to be focused on this film. So the initial interviews were not made for the film, were made for the archive.
Yeah.
And also because of visual aspects, now we had to focus on a common aesthetics, and that would look like a political thriller and the clair-obscur and
Oh yeah.
Tlantla.
My honey. Tlantla Matetwa. Tlantla.
It took me a week. It took me a week to pronounce his name.
Only?
He says that I do it fine now, but I think it's out of courtesy.
And Tlantla Matetwa is a gem. He's a filmmaker. His passion is archive. So in South Africa, he is world renowned. Any company from around the world knows that your first stop in South Africa is in Tlantla. And he's a classic character because he literally is carrying tapes in the trunk of his car. So he has watched Southern African history more than anyone. And because of that passion, we were able to employ him to travel the world to the countries in which this conflict occurred to look for archive. And looking for archive is an incredibly enriching experience because you find in various countries that don't have the resources to preserve the archive, the need to preserve the archive. We would sit, those beautiful experiences in Mozambique where the old man would be bringing out with gloves the reels, the 16mm propaganda reels from Mozambican TV that he would have to thread on his flatbed to then show it. So it was
the ones that had been saved from a fire and from a bombing.
It was a very rich experience because I feel very strongly that we need to be careful about repeating the same images, particularly about the end of apartheid. I think you desensitize your audience if you keep seeing that same shot, and it also makes the distance between you, the viewer, and that so-called strange country called South Africa very far. I think what we wanted to do, because we had a protagonist, somebody to take us on this journey, was to make you feel that you were in the action.
And if you I mean, you don't need to travel to get archive if you're aiming at BBC or CNN, because you just call them and then tell them what you need and they send it to you. But then what you get is what everybody has been watching for decades. So if you want some original archive, then you need to do what Ntlanhla was doing, to travel to Mozambique and go to, well, in the Mozambican case we also went, but to many other countries he went on his own, or to, when we went to shoot in Havana, he also came with us. And
okay, then it was a nearly collaboration between you, Stephen Smith, and
oh yeah, he was, and
Ntlanhla
Ntlanhla was part of our team.
Yeah.
I mean, he worked with us for three years. Yeah. I mean, as he was uncovering, he would be sending it, Carlos, do you like this? What else? I mean, what else are you looking for? We were also, from an African Oral History Archive perspective, interested in all that footage, because we believe that there are so many different stories to tell. We believe in assisting other countries that have got this incredible record of their country's history, but it's dying, it's getting lost. So it's a very important part of preserving African heritage and preserving and telling African stories is to preserve the archive.
And there was like a first stage in the working with him, in which he would get all this archive from all the countries and send it on a drive. I would watch it, and all the hundreds of hours. But then once we had a cut, I started requesting particular things. I need images from Paris in the 60s. And then he would say, but Carlos, you've got that. Look at this folder, this, in that point you got that. Okay, I didn't realize. And I would go there, oh, maybe, okay, we don't have any of that, but let me get back to you in a couple of weeks. And he would, go all around, ask for images of Paris in the 60s here and there, and get interesting stuff. And many times it was, because initially I had like this talking heads cut without any archive, just to build the story and discuss it with Mandy and with Steven. But then when we really wanted to have a proper film, we started including archive, and then many of the scenes would be told through the archive, and I was all the time trying to get rid of sentences and dialogue and say, okay, this can be told with an image of a plane going here to there, or this can be told with an image of, so we don't need to have all the time trying to get rid of sentences, because there's so much talking in the film. And we knew that in all countries it would be subtitled. In France it's better, because all the French is not subtitled, so you don't have to read all the... But when you watch the film with German subtitles, for example, absolutely everything is subtitled. The French, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese and the Afrikaans. So it's really crazy to go through the film with German subtitles or Italian subtitles, or so we were all trying to get rid of dialogue and tell things through. And luckily enough, many times these images by itself would suggest you a new structure for a scene, or a new way to introduce a scene, or so. Yeah, it was a very, very interesting job.
And what was your bigger challenge for this film? The biggest difficulties?
For me, it was, I think probably for Mandy the same. It was finding the balance between the
biography,
the story, the adventure of Jean-Yves, the story of Jean-Yves, and a historical explanation, how this historical background gets through to the audience so we didn't want the film to become Jean-Yves' biography, but
we also didn't want it to become a history lesson.
So we wanted a protagonist, but this protagonist should not take too much protagonism. So that was the most difficult balance, and I think the hottest discussions among the team were always around this issue and how to. Yes, we're filmmakers, so we get in love with main characters and we want to tell personal stories, but at the end, this has to be a historical documentary in a way and be serious and not because we're treating a real story and a real that involves many historical issues and political issues, so you can't just throw all that aside and become crazy about the storytelling and making a political thriller. So it was sometimes difficult to find this balance.
I mean, just in one sentence, we never, ever, and to this minute, want to create the impression that Jean-Yves Olivier freed Nelson Mandela.
Exactly.
You know, it's very easy to simplify the story, but Carlos uses the word, and it's a good word. He was one brick of the wall, and there were many different parts of how do you release Mandela. He played an important role, but he was an engine, so he gave us a taxi driver into the issues. But for us, as the African Oral History Archive, it's as important to give voice to the actual players themselves, the Winnie Mandelas of the world. So that was always a very tight balance between as my good friend Michel says, le je, et l'histoire d'Afrique du Sud. I have to go get pretty.
You're really cool. Will the film look better after Mandela's death? Will it look more important?
I hope not. No.
I think there will be a short period of time when Mandela will be the only issue in the news, but as you know, journalism works, this is temporary things, and after 2 weeks people are talking about something different because another thing has happened. So this will be a very short period of time when I don't know how it will affect the film, if it will be good, bad or whatever, but it definitely will affect in some way, but it will be a very short. I mean, given this film's life in festivals, in commercial distributions, in televisions, the main part of its life might be 3 or 4 years, and then it might be shown every now and then in different places, but in those 3 or 4 years the way it's affected by the death of Mandela, it will be a very short period of time, I think.
I wish we could have finished the film when Mandela was still alive, because I would have wanted to show him the film, to have his reactions, because that's what African oral history is about. It's about dialoguing with history and saying that there's many stories to tell, and that's what I hope he would say. But I don't, if there is a possibility for people when Mandela's gone, and he is gone, you know, in terms of active contribution at the moment, to then say, well, there are other untold stories that were the people to unlock Mandela's key, then we're doing our job wrong. And you're doing your job wrong. I'm teasing you, but it's really important. I think Jean-Yves Olivier will be the first one to say, I'm not the man that freed Nelson Mandela. I was one of many behind-the-scenes stories. Mine was a regional story, but there's so many others who risked their lives to end apartheid.
Yeah.
And I don't think we finished this film to time it with the demise of Mandela. We wanted to finish it in a year, 3 years ago, but such a complex story. Documentaries have their own life.
Do you want to add something? Something I forget?
No, I think your questions were lovely. Thank you.
I ask last things to ask you. If I find it. Yeah.
Michel, you come tonight?
I come, but I do need to go else before, so I'm going to leave you now as we have finished the schedule.
Okay, and
Ask you a little.
nous sommes finis avec
sign?
Ivo.
Yeah.
Where?
Ivo
Here or
is
here?
finished
Here.
here.
Oh, bravo.
Next door. So he finally was very busy all afternoon.
So it worked perfectly.
I think it
For me it was, I think probably for Mandy the same, it was finding the balance between the
biography.
Yeah, the story, the adventure of Jean-Yves, the story of Jean-Yves, and a historical explanation, how this historical background gets through to the audience through so we didn't want the film to become Jean-Yves' biography, but
we also didn't want it to become a history lesson.
So we wanted a protagonist, but this protagonist should not take too much protagonism. So that was the most difficult balance, and I think the hottest discussions among the team were always around this issue and how to. Yes, we're filmmakers, so we get in love with main characters and we want to tell personal stories, but at the end, this has to be a historical documentary in a way and be serious and not. Because we're treating a real story and a real that involves many historical issues and political issues, so you can't just throw all that aside and become crazy about the storytelling and making a political thriller. So it was sometimes difficult to find this balance.
I mean, just in one sentence, we never, ever, and to this minute, want to create the impression that Jean-Yves Olivier freed Nelson Mandela.
Exactly.
You know, it's very easy to simplify the story, but Carlos uses the word, and it's a good word. He was one brick of the wall, and there were many different parts of how do you release Mandela. He played an important role, but he was an engine, so he gave us a taxi driver into the issues. But for us, as the African Oral History Archive, it's as important to give voice to the actual players themselves, the Winnie Mandelas of the world. So that was always a very tight balance between as my good friend Michel says, le je, et l'histoire d'Afrique du Sud. I hope not. No.
I think there will be a short period of time when Mandela will be the only issue in the news, but as you know, journalism works, these are temporary things, and after 2 weeks people are talking about something different because another thing has happened. So this will be a very short period of time when I don't know how it will affect the film, if it will be good, bad or whatever, but it definitely will affect in some way, but it will be a very short. I mean, given this film's life in festivals, in commercial distributions, in televisions, the main part of its life might be 3 or 4 years, and then it might be shown every now and then in different places. But in those 3 or 4 years, the way it's affected by the death of Mandela, it will be a very short period of time, I think.
I wish we could have finished the film when Mandela was still alive, because I would have wanted to show him the film, to have his reactions, because that's what African oral history is about. It's about dialoguing with history and saying that there's many stories to tell, and that's what I hope he would say. But I don't, if there is a possibility for people when Mandela's gone, and he is gone, you know, in terms of active contribution at the moment, to then say, well, there are other untold stories that were the people to unlock Mandela's key, then we're doing our job wrong. And you're doing your job wrong. I'm teasing you, but it's really important. I think Jean-Yves Olivier will be the first one to say, I'm not the man that freed Nelson Mandela. I was one of many behind-the-scenes stories. Mine was a regional story, but there's so many others who risked their lives to end apartheid.
Yeah.
And I don't think we finished this film to time it with the demise of Mandela. We wanted to finish it in a year, 3 years ago, but such a complex story. Documentaries have their own life.